was tuned in to Dylan, because Dylan's thing was like, don't ask me what it means, man. I wrote it. I don't know what it means. What do you think it means? He was just constantly going.
Her name was retained by Bob Dylan. Secret for 60 years, but at 83, he—as eventually speaking, he wrote his most well-known songs and met her in 1963. About her, and even his closest friends saw a change in him when she went. Was unaware of the facts, Dylan's astounding admission clarifies everything. The motorbike accident, the Bob Dylan's disappearance during his peak of stardom and his born-again phase. Robert Allen Zimmerman was born in Guthrie, Minnesota, on May 24, 1941. His parents, when Bob was 6 years old, Abram and Beatrice, were members of a tiny Jewish community. After his father contracted polio, the family relocated to the chilly mining town of Hibbing, where it was a harsh location where mother had grown up, with many iron workers and bitterly severe winters. Bob was a quiet youngster whose early thoughts were influenced by the foghorns from nearby Guthrie. His family is from Ukraine, and he frequently loses himself in his own world due to his asthma. And Lithuania, and that combination of adversity and history would eventually appear in his. When Bob first heard rock and roll on the radio, his perspective on music shifted. He encountered Hank Williams and Elvis Presley when he was around 10. The song became popular. He claimed that Hank's speech pushed him hard, like an electric shock. He had a natural ability to sit at his family's piano and begin playing by ear. Gift. He simply listened and played, he didn't need sheet music. His chords were odd but strong, and people saw that his family owned nearby movie theaters, so Bob began playing the guitar at the age of 14 after seeing a lot of musical performances on television. And began starting bands. He was enamored with Little Richard's music and outrageous costumes and stage presence, which Bob aspired to emulate. By high school, Bob was he became interested in music and formed the Golden Chords, a band that played fast-paced, loud rock and roll. Performed so loudly at a school talent contest that the principal shut off the microphone, which is said to have contributed to Dylan's fame. Even although several musicians later claimed that things didn't go exactly as planned, Bob's high school yearbook even stated his ambition, leaving a trace of loud, rebellious energy, was to accompany Little Richard. He wasn't joking. Bob had an odd habit of fabricating information about himself and telling pupils that he was an orphan from when he relocated to New Mexico. He enjoyed making up stories even if none of it was true. The lies increased in Minneapolis in 1959 as he gave individuals a variety of made-up stories. He made a joke about losing his true love and turning into an inebriated worker in one interview. Being a Chinese person and contracting tuberculosis was absurd, yet he even adopted fictitious names, such as Saint Gun Bob, as part of his act. He was developing a persona while playing music. He had witnessed musicians and even wrestlers do it, and he realized that that same year, Bob realized that being a performer entailed having a tail, even if it wasn't true. Attended the University of Minnesota, but he left since he wasn't interested in the school. Into a little apartment above a pharmacy in the student-heavy neighborhood of Dinky Town there, among poets and political outcasts, he discovered his true self. Searching for he occasionally got fired for asking for a few dollars a night to play at neighborhood coffee shops. For further information, he initially presented himself in one of those tiny settings. Nobody knows the origin of the name, but some claim it was inspired by Bob Dylan. Some claim it originated from a cowboy on a television program, while others attribute it to the poet Dylan Thomas. The reason the name stuck in Dinky Town, Bob was given a book by someone called Woody Guthrie's Bound for Glory, an autobiography, was the book that made Bob quit football. He acquired an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar, and he began penning songs that sounded more protest and folk than rock and roll. He finished college at the end of 1960, packed up, and moved out. Minnesota permanently. In the bitterly cold January months in 1961, Bob Dylan, at 19 years old, got off a bus in New York City with a guitar. He had just driven from Minnesota for almost 24 hours straight, with a suitcase and a hope. For the sole purpose of seeing Woody, despite the harsh winter conditions. Since Dylan first read Bound for Glory, Guthrie had been his hero. Book that chronicled a young man's quest for meaning in song. Now Guthrie was ill and gradually deteriorating while residing in a mental health facility in New Jersey. Dylan nevertheless traveled despite having Huntington's illness, and in some way, even in Guthrie, who was hardly able to talk, had the opportunity to sing for the guy who influenced his musical vision in that lonely hospital room. Gave Dylan a message that read, "I ain't dead yet." Dylan was struck by that statement. Came home and composed "Strong to Woody." It was one of just 2 original songs on his Guthrie's music from the 1913 massacre was included in his debut album because folk singers did just that, passing things down a few months later. John Hammond of Columbia Records sensed something in Dylan's first serious attempt. The majority of the label's employees believed Dylan was an error. They referred to his foolishness as Hammond's, because Hammond had discovered stars before Billy Holiday. Arthur Franklin signed Dylan because he wasn't going to give up. Dylan traveled to Columbia in October 1961 without a lawyer and didn't require one. "I would have signed anything," he claimed. The recording sessions were brief and inexpensive, just $42 spread across 3 afternoons. But Dylan found it difficult to remain on the microphone, popping every P and hissing every S. "I couldn't sing the same song again, therefore I detested doing second takes," he warned them repeatedly. That being obstinate didn't help his debut album, which hardly sold 5,000 copies in the first year, but Hammond was correct. Due to the fact that those 5,000 copies were only the start. Dylan met Sus Rowe was a young, intelligent, attractive woman who would make everything different. Intensely political, she grew up with parents who were Communist Party members. Dylan was immediately drawn to her energy while she was around protest and activism, and by when they first moved in together in 1962, Sus opened his eyes by introducing him to poetry, international cinema, avant-garde theater, and most importantly, politics. With her, he began to perceive more than just songs. He began to see songs with meaning, such as From That, Masters of War and The Death of EMTT Till emerged. One of his most famous pictures, the two of them strolling arm in arm, was also influenced. On the cover of Bob Dylan and the Freewheel, they appeared to be just any young couple in love, but Dylan's celebrity was expanding and the pressure inside was increasing. Their personalities didn't get along in 1964, but their love helped shape his voice. Was unable to withstand the storm it contributed to, but the village Greenwich Village remained and had developed into a folk music hub. World every night, Dylan's voice and guitars filled coffee shops. Performed at Café Wa in Goethe's Folk City, the final location that mattered. Tiny, frigid apartments, poor food, and borrowed clothes made for a difficult existence, yet it was magic. You could hear the future in every place you went down McDougal Street. Doorway performers competed, observed, and learned from one another. Dylan became sharper, faster, and more daring as a result of that pressure. Dylan began creating his own mystique in interviews after being made stranger. Utterly false and outrageous tales. He once told Playboy that after losing his true love while playing cards, he began singing rock and roll. He said he once woke up in a pool hall after turning into a Chinese in Phoenix. Worked as a model for Charles Atlas before moving in with a 13-year-old girl. When the journalist questioned Dylan if all of that resulted in rock music, he said, "No, that's how all of it sounded correct, but none of it was true. I have tuberculosis. He didn't want to be Minnesota's Robert Zimmerman, he desired to be Bob Dylan, whatever that was. He therefore made it up as he went along, and even as the story became more bizarre, his songs became sharper. Wrote about EMTT's death in 1962. The next year, the song Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll shocked listeners with its serene harsh reality. A wealthy white man killed Hattie, a black woman. Dylan told the entire tale, not just pointing fingers, after 6 months. Poetry by people, the system, and the silence. It was no longer merely protest. Dylan performed at the Newport Folk Festival in the summer of 1963, just as the world was beginning to take attention. The largest folk music stage at the age of 22, the audience was already familiar with his name. He sang Blowing in the Wind Joan while wearing a faded army shirt. Then came the Freedom Singers and Baez Pete Seeger, and We'll Beat the Crowd. Billboard magazine described it as the festival's most impactful moment. It was evident to all that Dylan was no longer merely a participant in the drama. Leading it, and a component of that ascent, was his friendship with Joan Baez. She was already well known when they first met, but she had faith in him and took him on stage. Helped him ascend and sung his songs. By 1963, they were partners both on and off stage. At the March on Washington, they all sang together just before Dr. King delivered his "Though Popularity Comes with a Cost, I Have a Dream" speech, and Dylan welcomed Baez on his 1965 UK tour, but he forbade her from performing. When he married someone else a few months later, she felt sad and abandoned. Baez would write songs about the suffering, particularly Rust and Diamonds, after it was ended. Then the times changed, and the title was a message in and of itself. It addressed a nation shocked by the assassination of JFK in 1964. Civil rights. With the Vietnam War looming and protests growing, Dylan understood what he was doing. He composed it as if it were an anthem. "Senators, congressmen, please answer the call. What is this shit?" a friend once questioned. Dylan shrugged, "It's what people want to hear." It was successful. The song crossed generations and oceans and gained a #1 position. Critics in Britain referred to it as timeless, but as the years went by, the Dylan began to change in the same year as his songs gained fresh significance for each generation who heard them. He took LSD once more, this time from the inside out, and began reading Rambo's songs. Become surreal on a road trip, he wanted to use words to paint pictures rather than point fingers. He composed the song, Chimes of Freedom, at the beginning of 1964. Thing didn't have a clear course. Instead, it simply flowed. In June, one evening after drinking alcohol, he spent 3 hours recording 14 tracks, which turned into another side of Bob Dylan. Was an obvious indication that his time of resistance was coming to an end. What happened next would fundamentally alter rock music. Bob Dylan shook the he published, bringing it all back home, in the music industry, and it wasn't just another electric instruments, guitars, drums, and a complete band filled the first half of the folk CD. It began with underground homesick blues, and after only a few seconds, you realized something had. Folk enthusiasts were perplexed because this was the performer who used to sing with Justin. He was now tearing into a harmonica and an acoustic guitar. Dylan, however, was well versed in electric rock. The second part of the record remained acoustic, but the lyrics had become stranger, sharper, and darker. It seemed as though he was displaying two sides of himself to everyone. The last track is now complete, and others are already racing into the future. It felt like a farewell to a lover, but also possibly to the whole folk scene that had attempted to prevent him from moving forward. And then the Rolling Stones arrived. Record execs detested it because it was 6 minutes lengthy, which was unprecedented for a single stations refused to air it because it was too lengthy and unpolished, but for some reason occurred one night at a club in New York. A copy of the song was played, and the audience went crazy. They pleaded the following morning. The DJ played it repeatedly until the record was exhausted. DJs had to flip the records, but radio stations were ringing and pleading for copies. People didn't care that the vinyl was played halfway through. The organ whetted behind Dylan's voice, and the lyrics struck like a punch. It seemed to go on forever. Paul McCartney described it as sounding like it could go on forever in a positive way. It's so intense that Frank Zappa even quipped that after listening to it, he wanted to stop making music. Dylan took the stage at the Newport Folk Festival a few days later. Had an attitude and wearing black leather boots, people assumed he was going to strum instead. He plugged in and played a few soft tunes with the accompaniment of an electric guitar and an organ. The crowd erupted as they tore into Maggie's farm. Some applauded, while others jeered. Pete Seeger allegedly stated that he intended to use an axe to sever the power wires as everyone was crying. Dylan's electrifying performance in front of a throng of bewildered and enraged folk fans turned into Elvis left the stage after just 3 songs, then appeared to quiet the crowd. He returned by himself and performed 2 acoustic songs, but the harm, or perhaps he would not return to Newport for another 37 years after the evolution was complete. The organ that produced its eerie sound like a rolling stone nearly didn't exist. Al Kooper, a guitarist who is 21 years old, was only present to see the recording session, but as soon as the producer left, Cooper stealthily slid. Fortunately, there was an instrument behind the organ that he didn't even know how to play. He stayed on and only played when he was certain of the chords. Quiet when he wasn't. That uncertainty caused the notes to have a strangely lovely pause when the producer came back, and Dylan enjoyed what he heard and told, but he laughed when he saw Cooper at the organ. Cooper's section remained in the finished version after they added an organ to the mix, and suddenly an unintentional organ line gained notoriety. The most dramatic event occurred in Manchester, England, in 1966. Dylan was on tour, dividing each performance into 2 parts, an acoustic and an electric one. Folk aficionados adored the first half, followed by the second. Dylan plunged into electric music with his band behind him. Songs after one, a single word was yelled by someone in the crowd: Judas. Dylan didn't recoil at the harsh charge. Instead, he leaned into the microphone. "And I don't believe you, you're a liar," he shot back. Then he turned to the band and said, "Play it loud." Nobody remembers that it thundered through the hall like a rolling stone. People searched for decades to identify the 2 individuals who yelled the obscenity. Claimed it, but nobody could ever be certain. Dylan secretly married that year. He married Sarah Loon in Long Island under an oak tree while taking a vacation from touring. It was so secret that the majority of his Dylan wanted to take advantage of the fact that Sarah's friends were unaware of her pregnancy. There's only. He denied it when questioned about it, and it wasn't until months after that the publication reported that Sarah's relationship was problematic. Worked as a secretary and model. She met Dylan when he was still in contact with Suz Ritello and Joan Baez, but Sarah was the person he married. Although first keeping it a secret, Dylan was simultaneously working on Blonde, a double album that turned up to be one of his best-selling records. He desired a Tone Mercury sessions in New York, which he regarded as thin and frantic. Didn't go thus. He traveled to Nashville, where he had an excellent session. In a few hectic days, the musicians recorded the majority of the album. Driven by coffee, adrenaline, and most likely more at one point into the night. At one point, Dylan began playing a brand new song that sounded like a marching band intoxicated. The producer made a joke about it. Dylan from the Salvation Army asked if they could obtain one, so they did. This is how Rainy Day Women numbers 12 and 35 came to life in the album opener, yet all of this the 1966 World Tour proved to be difficult, as every night the audience would boo, hiss, and walk after his solo performance before returning with his band for the electrified set. The same acoustic cheers and electric outrage were heard in city after city. Robbie Robertson later remarked that Dylan appeared to be in a state of exhaustion. One night, he nearly drowned in a Dylan was high on drugs and fumes after his last performance in London, and he might hardly talk on stage before the July 29 disaster. Dylan was killed in 1966 while riding his motorcycle close to Woodstock. The specifics are unclear. Some people believe it wasn't as serious because there was no ambulance and no hospital record. Dylan later concealed it, but others seem to think it was serious. Said that the collision was a means of escaping the attention, the stress, and whatever the reality, he vanished from the public view for a while, possibly due to narcotics. Dylan found serenity in Woodstock for a long period in the months that followed. He made music, went on a walk in the woods with his dog, and chopped wood with his family. The Hawks lived in the basement of a pink house called Big Pink, which gave rise to a complete